lovely Misfitians, and welcome to another video. First off, I want to say I think, fighting a little bit of a cold, so if I sound a little bit nasally today, I do apologize. I am a little bit stuffy and a little under the weather, but that being said, as promised, I did want to make sure that I put together our very first tutorial for 2019. Now, this is the first video in several that I'm going to be teaching you how to paint a snowy background with that beautiful leaping deer. And a lot of you already know this if you have been following me on Instagram, and I also teased it at the end of 2018. So this is actually the first video getting into that painting. And today, the very first thing that we're going to be doing is learning how to prep your station for a successful painting, which is actually a very crucial skill to have. So this is something that I personally never really thought about as a beginner, but as I started working in watercolor, I realized that there was a certain way of how I structured my workspace that helped my work flow through a painting. And I'm going to be showing you how I set up my workspace to really help aid in the flow of a painting during the actual process. So the very first thing that you actually want to ask yourself is, what hand do you paint with? This is going to sound really silly, but it actually does help in how you set up your workstation. So since I paint with my right hand, I want to make sure that all of my paints and all of my watery, liquidy parts are on my right side. And the reason for this is I don't want my water on the left side, because if I'm going to clean my brushes, I'm going to be reaching over my painting, and I could, by chance, drop or spill some water or even paint onto my painting in an area that I didn't want. So by just making sure that my right side has all of my watery, liquidy parts on it, such as my palette and my paints and my water and my brushes, basically anything that could chance drip something onto my painting, as long as that's on the side that I am painting with, I'm going to avoid that problem. Okay, so that is pretty much how I set up my workspace. The next thing that you need to really think about before we even get into painting and illustration is really think about your approach to the painting. So this is another thing that I think as a beginner, I usually just thought, oh, everything just comes naturally and with ease as you're painting. Well, what I've noticed after reading a lot of biographies and also listening to a lot of other artists is they plan ahead. And I very much plan ahead. I usually use thumbnails and really think about how I'm going to approach this painting. And I do this before I lay paintbrush to page, and it really does help so much. So now we're going to be talking about how to actually prep for your painting. And the first thing that you really want to have before you approach any painting is a really good drawing or sketch of what you actually want to paint. And I know this sounds like kind of a duh, Carrie moment, but it really does help having a good drawing before you approach a painting. Especially when you're working with watercolor. Since watercolor is transparent, basically if you decide to change something midway through a painting, it's very difficult to actually change it because you're going to see things layering on top of one another. So when you're painting with watercolor, what I like to think of is, you know how you have stained glass windows? And those are the things that are basically shining the color through with the sunlight. think of watercolor the same way. Your sun or your brightness is basically your paper, and then the stained glass or the colors are your layers of watercolor or paint that you're putting on top of that. Since you approach watercolor in this way, it's actually really hard to hide mistakes, which I'm sure you've probably encountered. So the way to prevent that is to actually plan ahead. Now, thankfully for you, you don't actually have to plan a sketch out or a drawing, because I am actually going to be providing this drawing for you in the link down below, included with a course on how to stretch watercolor paper. And the reason why I'm including this drawing with that course is because of the next thing. I know this painting is going to require a lot of water. So I want to make sure that I am stretching my paper the traditional way. Now, you are fully welcome to stretch your paper with just masking tape. However, since we're going to be using a lot of water with this particular painting, it will remain flatter and there will be less buckling, basically making it easier for you to paint if you staple it down. And that particular course, I show you the 3 different ways of how to actually stretch your watercolor paper, and one of those is the traditional way, which is stapling. Okay, now that we have our workstation prepped and we also have our stellar drawing ready to go, and finally we have stretched our paper down the traditional way, the very last thing that you need to do to prep your painting is to make sure that you are saving the white on your page. So once again, going back to the idea of stained glass. If you have a, let's say, lighter color of yellow glass, you're definitely not going to want to put a darker color in front of it, because that's going to distort that yellow and it's also going to make it less bright. The same is true with watercolor. Since we have some lighter colors, such as our deer is definitely going to be a lot lighter than our darker sky, we want to make sure that we preserve that deer, and we also want to make sure we preserve our stars and our trees and anything that might be snowy white. And the way I'm going to be doing that is through 2 methods. I am going to be using, first off, masking fluid. I personally really like this brand. However, I know it doesn't smell that great, so I'm going to warn you. It does have a smell, but I feel like this particular brand, it dries the fastest and it doesn't pull and tear at my paper like several of the other brands that I have played around with. So this is the particular brand that I use. And basically what I'm going to do is mask the areas that I feel could be contaminated with my dark sky that I'm going to be painting later. Now, I will say I really wish that I had masked these 2 little trees in the very front. Later on in the painting, I realized I think I want to leave these white. And by that point, it was actually too late to mask, so I had to work around them, but learn from my mistakes. I would mask those trees now. So those are the areas that I would mask. And then the second way that I would preserve white is I actually use masking tape a lot of times for larger areas. And you will notice me stretching out pieces of masking tape over that slope area that's going to be snowy white. Now, I will say I do not recommend painting over the masking tape the way I'm layering it. This is mainly just to be a precaution to make sure that I don't get any spots or drips on this particular section. Since there's actually not a lot of dark near this area, in order to save my masking fluid and also make it go a little bit faster, I just used strips of tape and taped over that little section. And then what I did is I took an X-Acto knife. Now you have to be very careful. You don't want to cut through your paper. You just want to cut through that top portion of tape. And basically what I did is I followed the line. You can actually see you're drawing lines through the masking tape, and you're going to want to follow that line and basically cut around that line and make sure that your hill has a nice smooth edge. And that is the prep work for painting a snowy watercolor painting. In the next lesson, I'm going to be teaching you actually how to do the background and how to approach getting your paints ready and all of that. But this is just the prep work before we even lay paint to page. That being said, since you stayed all the way to the end of this tutorial, please leave comments down below of other things that you would maybe like for me to teach in the future. I am going to be adding more tutorials to this channel in the future. I'm not going to do them every week because it does take a lot of time, but in the future I am going to be adding more tutorials similar to this and the other ones that are coming out. So please let me know in the comments down below of other things that you would like for me to teach. And that is it for today. Lots of love, y'all, and I will see you in the next video.